Hello everyone, welcome to the session How to Maintain and Automate Compliance on AWS. My name is Cristina Rios Iribarren and I am a Solutions Architect Team Lead for Public Sector Customers.
And I am Laura Verholte, I'm a Senior Solution Architect for Public Sector Customers at AWS.
Today you will learn how to maintain compliance at scale on your AWS resources.
And we're going to start by setting the scene on why compliance is so important, some common challenges that we see customers have when trying to audit at scale, and how AWS can help you.
You will learn how to automate the collection of compliance information using AWS Audit Manager.
We will then have a look at some of the data sources, so how we can create automated compliance checks with AWS Config, as well as how we can assess vulnerabilities with AWS Security Hub.
And we also want to show you how to remediate, how to take action on those security and compliance risks using AWS Systems Manager.
Okay, and to make sure that we're all on the same page, compliance here refers to the cloud-related regulatory requirements. And why is it so important? Well, obviously, we want to meet the law, we want to manage risk, and we want to maintain our customers' trust. Because a breach or regulatory issue can make you lose customer trust so easily, and we want to help you prevent that.
Now, why automation? And here the answer is very simple. We humans are prone to error. So if you automate compliance, you ensure consistency across different regions and accounts and all your environments. You can provision your infrastructure faster and dedicate that time back to your core business goals. You can build reusable templates and then use it across different projects and teams. And again, this will save you time and costs, as you don't need to go through the setup every time. And last, as you know, different organizations and industries have different security and compliance needs, which will change, which will evolve over time. If you automate this infrastructure deployment, then it will be easier to keep track of changes. So it will be easier to audit and it will be easier to maintain compliance.
And the good news is AWS provides a number of services and features that can help you meet compliance requirements. So this is a schema here. You can kind of see it as a continuous cycle that you can take into account when maintaining and automating compliance.
The first part is risk assessment, a process for discovering, evaluating, and ranking regulatory risks for your organization. This should drive the adoption of technical, organizational, and contractual controls that will help you meet those requirements. If we look at the technical side, AWS Audit Manager will be the service collecting your information from your AWS usage, and then it will provide audit-ready reports.
And you can create security and compliance checks using AWS Config and AWS Security Hub. And then we can use AWS Systems Manager to manage automatic remediation.
All right, let's dive in. Let's start by automating the collection of compliance information. But before we dive into Audit Manager, you need to know about AWS Artifact. As we always say, security is a shared responsibility between us, AWS, and you, the customer. And compliance is also a shared responsibility. AWS Artifact is the go-to place for AWS side of things. It's a central resource for compliance-related information. Here, you can find on-demand access to security and compliance reports from AWS and also independent software vendors who sell their products on their marketplace. You can review, accept, and manage agreements and even access compliance reports from third-party auditors. During this presentation, we'll be working with an example. This is a well-known framework called PCI DSS, but the technologies we'll be talking about can be used potentially to any other framework. PCI, as context, provides a baseline of technical and operational requirements designed to protect account data. So if a customer business involves credit cards, then they will need to care about PCI. And in Artifact, you can access the PCI DSS package, which includes two main documents. The first one is called Attestation of Compliance. So this one shows that AWS has been successfully validated against this standard. And the second one is AWS Responsibility Summary. So this one will help you effectively manage this cardholder environment and help you better understand what are your responsibilities when it comes to that. Now, let's move on to your side of things. You can use AWS Audit Manager to audit your AWS usage to simplify risk and compliance assessment. The service will map your compliance, your AWS usage data with the compliance requirements. So the first thing you need to do is to select or create a framework, for example, PCI. The second one is you define the scope of the assessment you wish to run. And then this service will collect evidence automatically based on that framework chosen, and it will generate an audit-ready report. And where does this service gather data from? For example, for PCI, a customer needs to show the auditor relevant logs capturing user activities related to encryption policies on EBS volumes. So then what Audit Manager will do is that it will scan CloudTrail logs that have those API calls, EBS API calls, just to see if there has been any encryption policy change, right? But this is just an example. Other sources of evidence could be AWS Config and AWS Security Hub, capturing configuration changes on your environment. And you can also manually upload evidence relevant to your company, for example, any company document, email, screenshots, and others. And again, Audit Manager will take that data and generate a report based on that framework that you chose. Now, I've mentioned the word framework many times already, but a framework determines which controls are tested in an environment over a period of time. And in AWS Audit Manager, you can find over 30 pre-built assessment frameworks you can use. For example, GDPR, PCI, HIPAA, CIS, and many others. And you can also create your own custom frameworks from scratch, or also by making an editable copy of one of these existing frameworks. You can use custom frameworks to organize controls into control sets in a way that meet your specific business requirements. And then you can replicate these custom controls to a different region or account, and all the control sets underlying that will be copied as well. Great. Now, what about you actually want to demonstrate an auditor that your environment is PCI compliant? It might get overwhelming. So now I'll show you in a demo how to create an assessment in Audit Manager and to understand the relevant evidence needed for that and where that evidence is coming from. The first thing you see on screen here is the Audit Manager dashboard. So it has a summary of my active assessment and some controls that are compliant and some controls that are non-compliant. So to create an assessment, I just go ahead and click on Create Assessment, and I can select one of the frameworks available, for example, PCI. I've already created this, so I'm gonna go to the left side and open my active assessment, PCI version 4. I have a summary here. For example, I can see on which S3 bucket my information is going to, the date I created the assessment, and of course the interesting part is at the bottom, the actual requirements that this framework is asking me. So all these requirements and all the controls that apply to each requirement. If I open one of them, for example, requirement 8 around identity, user, and authentication, I open one of them as an example around strong authentication, And I see that Audit Manager is already collecting a lot of information. I open one of the folders, and I can see, for example, on the fourth column, the data source. This is coming from Security Hub, and this specific control is failed. So this one is around requiring SSL for S3 buckets. Okay, so I know now that I need to do something with this specific control. Now, if I go back, and I can scroll down, I see that some controls are coming from config, Security Hub, and one of them is passed. Great. So this one, I know that the requirement of having HTTPS on my load balancers is going well. So yeah, nothing to be done on that control. Now we've seen that Audit Manager will take evidence from multiple data sources. Let's see now AWS config as one of these sources of evidence.
Okay, let's see how we can create automated compliance checks with AWS config. And let's start with what is AWS config. AWS config is a continuous monitoring and assessment service that provides you with an inventory of your resources, as well as with, it's going to capture configuration changes of those resources. And it's going to capture configuration changes of resources, but it can also capture configuration changes of software on those resources if you have a Systems Manager agent installed. Now, why is this service so interesting? Well, first of all, I can create rules that are going to check compliance with security policies, industry best practices, and compliance standards. And on top of that, I can also put in place remediation actions that are automatically going to remediate any non-compliances. Okay, now how does this work together with Audit Manager? How does it integrate? Well, as Christina mentioned, AWS config is one of the data sources for Audit Manager. So first of all, I need to make sure that I'm going to enable AWS config as a service. And then secondly, I need to make sure that I'm going to enable the specific rules that Audit Manager needs. So I need to add the rules. And once I add these rules, this is going to start collecting compliance information. So it's going to start checking if I'm compliant or not compliant. And it's going to forward this information as evidence to Audit Manager. Now, I've mentioned rules a few times. So basically, with rules, I'm going to tell what exactly is going to be the desired state of my resources. So what I consider to be compliant. And we have two types of rules. We first of all have the managed rules. So these are rules that are defined and maintained by AWS, and they require minimal to no configuration from your side. And then on the other hand, I also have custom rules. And here I can kind of codify my own specific rules based on the specific requirements that I need in my organization. And in order to help you with that, we have the Rule Development Kit. This is an open source tool that you can use to create these rules, to author them, to test them, and so on. Now, when you see a config rule in Audit Manager, it's always going to be one of the managed rules. However, you can also use custom rules with Audit Manager, but here this would more replace one of the manual evidence sources that you automate with config. And for the rules, we have two types of evaluation modes. First of all, we have proactive evaluation, and then we also have detective evaluation. With proactive evaluation, we're going to evaluate if our resources are compliant before we're going to deploy these resources. And this could be very useful when we're, for example, creating resource templates that I'm going to share later with my organization, and I want to make sure before I share them that they're going to be compliant. Another example where this proactive evaluation is very useful is to integrate into my CI/CD pipeline. So I could check if my resource is compliant before actually deploying it. And I also want to point out with proactive evaluation that not all of the managed AWS config rules do support this mode. Now, to give you an idea of how this proactive evaluation mode works, I can use proactive compliance either via the AWS config API, so this includes the CLI, the SDK, or with CloudFormation guards. And so in my CI/CD pipeline, I would use the AWS config API to check the compliance before deploying my resources. And when deploying using AWS CloudFormation, I can set up CloudFormation hooks that are proactively going to check my configuration, if I'm compliant or not, before the actual deployments. Now, on the screen here, you can see an example of using this proactive evaluation mode with the CLI. So you can see I ask to start an evaluation, proactive mode, and then I give my resources and all of the resource details. And as an output, I'm going to get an evaluation ID. So in the background, it's going to do this evaluation. And then I can check with this resource evaluation ID if I was compliant or not. So I would do an additional request, and it will give me as an output compliant or not compliant. Now, going back to the previous slide here, this evaluation mode, proactive evaluation, is not going to be used by Audit Manager because, well, with Audit Manager, we're looking if our existing resources are compliant or not. However, this is a very interesting mode when we're thinking about the maintaining compliance part. Okay, then we also have the detective evaluation mode. And here we're going to detect or evaluate resources after they have been deployed. And this is the mode that is going to be used by Audit Manager. And with this mode, you might be wondering, okay, but how often is it going to evaluate? And this is going to be up to us. So we're going to have to specifically trigger an evaluation. And the first trigger, or the first time it's going to be evaluated, is when I actually add the specific rule. So when I create a rule, I add it, it's going to check initially if I'm compliant or not. And then after that, I'll need to trigger an evaluation. And there are a few different ways I can do this. First of all, we have periodic evaluation. And so with periodic evaluation, I'm going to define a timing on how often I want this to be checked. Let's say, for example, every 24 hours, I want to check if I'm compliant or not. Then another option is configuration changes. So here I'm going to run these evaluations when there's a change in configuration for a resource that is going to match my rule's scope. And then lastly, we also have hybrids. So here we're basically going to have a combination of the two previous options. Now, you might be wondering, okay, this is great, but I have multiple regions, I work in multiple accounts, so how are we going to do this at scale? And for that, we have AWS config conformance packs. And a conformance pack is basically a collection of rules and remediation actions that you can deploy. And it nicely integrates with AWS organizations. And one of the very interesting things with conformance packs is that it actually has sample templates with operational best practices for AWS services, compliance frameworks, and one of them is PCI. So let's have a deeper look into the conformance packs for these PCI. So as you can see on the left screenshot of the slide, we have 3 different conformance packs for these PCI DSS. The bottom one points to version 3, and then the top 2 ones point to the add-ons needed for version 4, and then depending which region I'm deploying it in, it's going to exclude or include the global resources. I also want to point out, if you look at the right QR code here, is that we have YAML templates for these conformance packs available. And I strongly recommend, when you're using these conformance packs, to tailor them to your specific needs. You might not only have the PCI conformance packs, maybe you have different frameworks, and you don't want to have the same rule deployed multiple times. So in order to save cost, tailor your conformance packs and only have the rules that you need, and maybe change rules if you have stricter requirements, see them as a template that you can build on. Okay, then how do we now practically set this up? Well, I have a quick demo starting from Audit Manager. So we can go to our different requirements here and go to one of the controls. So let's say I take 3.5.1, and I can click on the different evidence sources here, and I can filter out all of the evidence sources that need AWS config. And you can see there are quite a lot, so let's take one of them, EC2 EBS encryption by default. And so let's now go to AWS config and set up this specific rule. So in AWS config, I can see on the left I have the different rules. There you can see an overview of which rules I already have in place. I don't have any yet, but let's now add a rule. And you can see I have the managed rules, I have the custom rules, and I can use the identifier I saw before, EC2 EBS encryption by default, to find the rule that I need. You can also see I have different evaluation modes. So here I'm going to check every 24 hours if I'm compliant or not. And now I can create this rule. And in the background, what's going to happen? We're going to have this initial evaluation that we discussed before. And it's going to check if I'm compliant or not. And then every 24 hours, it's going to do this again. Now, let's have a look at our conformance pack, because I don't want to add every rule individually, right? So let's deploy a conformance pack here. You can see we have our sample templates, or I could also upload my own. And I'm going to implement the operational best practices for PCI DSS. So in this case, the version 3.1. I will give this a name. And once I go through all of the different steps, what's going to happen in the background is all of the different rules inside of this conformance packs are going to be created for me. And I'm going to start my evaluation to see if I'm compliant or not. And at the end, I'll also see a compliance score on how well I did, which rules were compliant or not. Okay, so this was it for the AWS config data source. Now Christina is going to tell you a little bit more about AWS Security Hub.
Thank you. While AWS config gives you more flexibility with these custom conformance packs, AWS Security Hub acts as the central place for security and compliance information out of the box. Let's see how you can assess vulnerabilities on your AWS usage using Security Hub. This service constantly performs security best practice checks and aggregates security findings from AWS and third-party services to enable an automated response. You have an overview, a layer on top that will aggregate and prioritize findings against frameworks like PCI, for example. So to summarize, if a compliance standard, such as PCI, is already present in Security Hub, then that's the easiest way to go. You can investigate findings via Security Hub integration with Amazon Detective, and also build automatic remediation actions with the integration with Amazon Event Bridge. We'll dive into that later on. And where does Security Hub gather data from? And the answer is that it gathers data from many underlying monitoring tools. For example, AWS config, as Laura explained to you. Also, Amazon GuardDuty, this is our intelligent threat detection service. Amazon Macie, the service that detects if there's any PII information on your S3 buckets, and many others. And again, what Security Hub will do is to aggregate and prioritize alerts arriving in the AWS environment across different accounts, services, and even third-party products, and make them all those findings accessible from a single point. And this service also generates its own findings by running security checks against rules that can be mapped with industry standards like PCI. So let's dive a bit deeper here. What is a security standard? A security standard is a set of requirements based on regulatory frameworks, industry best practices, or your own company policies. When you enable a standard, Security Hub will automatically enable all the controls that apply to it, and then this service will run security checks on those controls and generate findings. And when you disable a standard, then Security Hub will stop running those security checks on the corresponding controls, so findings will no longer be generated. You can use the PCI DSS standard to discover security vulnerabilities on resources that handle cardholder data. And important note is that Security Hub currently scopes the controls at the account level. So we recommend that you enable these controls in all of your accounts that store, process, or transfer data that contain cardholder information. Now, coming back to the beginning, Audit Manager will take automatically findings generated by Security Hub as a form of evidence and will combine it with other sources of evidence, right? As CloudTrail logs, as I said at the beginning, as config information and other sources to generate that report that will be ready for auditing. Let's see how it looks, all this on a demo. We are now PCI on the Audit Manager dashboard. We will go to one of the controls, just as an example, click on that, and as Laura did before with config, we can filter evidence sources, and now we will select the Security Hub one. So there are many controls there. This evidence is being gathered by Security Hub, and we'll take as an example one mapping called EC2.2. Now let's have a look at the Security Hub side of things. First thing we need to do is to enable config and Security Hub this here. And once I enable these services, then I can go ahead to the left side under controls and look for this example. So it was EC2.2. This control, by the way, is around security groups, seeing whether they allow or not inbound and outbound traffic. Now we see that there is no data here, well, of course, because we need to enable a standard first. So I'm going to go ahead to Security Standards, look for PCI, and I'm going to enable this standard. What this will do is that it will enable all the controls that apply to it, so then security checks will be running, and then that will generate findings, right? It will enable also the underlying config rules, everything that is needed to collect that information. And after a while, this service will give me as well a security score. Great. Now, what happens if one of my controls is no longer compliant? Laura, what could we do if that happens?
Yes, thank you, Christina. So how can we automatically put in place remediation? Well, we can do that with AWS Systems Manager Automation documents. And what is AWS Systems Manager Automation? Well, this is one of the features of AWS Systems Manager, and it's going to automate common repetitive IT operations and manage tasks across AWS resources. And basically the workflow exists of 3 big steps. First of all, I need to create a document, and this document needs to contain all of the different steps. So I'm going to explain what needs to happen in order to remediate something. This is going to be written in JSON or in YAML. And we have predefined documents by AWS that you can use, and you can also create your own. I strongly recommend you to have a look at what already exists. These are based on common use cases that we see customers have. So in most cases, you're probably going to find an existing one for what you need, or you could use it as a template to then tailor it to your specific needs. Then secondly, we need to run the automation. And this could either be manually triggered, so we can go into the console, trigger this automation document, or, of course, we could also automatically trigger this. And this is what is interesting for our use case here. And then lastly, we can monitor and test our automation. And so let's now look a little bit deeper into this automatically triggering that I just mentioned. And one of the ways that we can do this is with AWS config remediation actions. And so AWS config remediation actions is going to be an option for each rule that we create in AWS config. I can add a remediation action and automatically execute the documents. So let's take an example again. So this is the example that I showed you in the AWS config demo. So this is the rule EC2 EBS encryption by default. And basically this one is going to check if the default configuration of my EBS volumes is encrypted or not. Let's say in this case, it's not encrypted, so it's not considered compliant. How do I fix this? Well, I need to execute this API call. I need to execute enable EBS encryption by default API. So I want to create a Systems Manager Automation document that executes this API call, and I want that to happen automatically. So when going into AWS config, I can go to Manage Remediation, and I can add a remediation action. And if you look at the left screenshot here, on the bottom parts, I can select an automation document. And if you look at the right, you can see we actually have a pre-existing document here. So you could just take this one, you add it into the remediation actions for the managing remediation, and we're good to go. So what happens now is I have this EBS, the default configuration of all EBS volumes. It's not encrypted, so it's not compliant, but I set up an AWS config rule that is going to check that, and it's going to notice that it's not compliant. But I set up a remediation action, so what should happen is automatically I'm going to trigger this automation document, and this automation document will execute the API call that I mentioned previously and remediate this. So from now on, the default configuration for EBS volumes is encrypted. Okay, so how does this work for Security Hub? Well, let's again take the example that we discussed previously. So we have our control EC2.2, and this one is going to check if the default security group of my VPC does not allow inbound or outbound rules. Well, as you can see on the bottom left here, I have 2 inbound rules, 2 outbound rules. This is not what we want, right? So how do I remediate this? I need to execute 2 API calls. I need to execute security group resource revoke ingress and egress API. So we need to again find a document, an automation document that will do that for us. And luckily, again, we have an existing document that already does that for us, the AWS Close Security Group. On the right, you can see in more detail what this looks like. I don't expect you to read through this now, but basically what it does is it's going to check, first of all, the inbound rules. If there are any, it's going to remove them. Same with the outbound rules. So how do we now automate this remediation? As Christina already mentioned, this one is going to work with Event Bridge. And Event Bridge can automatically trigger this remediation action. And Event Bridge is basically a service where it's going to look for an event to happen in your account. And if that event happens, it will execute an action. So let's see how this works with our example. We have our security group here. It's not compliant. And we're going to now collect this information. Now, actually, with AWS Systems Manager, under the hood, a lot of these controls use AWS config to collect this information. And this is one of them. So this one in the background actually creates an AWS config rule. And you can recognize those in the console as well. They'll all have a prefix with Security Hub. And this rule will detect it's not compliant. It will forward this information to Security Hub. And Security Hub will give a failed status. And so we need to set up an Event Bridge rule that looks for the compliance status of this control to be failed. If so, then we'll execute our Systems Manager Automation. So we execute this automation. This in the background executes the different API calls, and we are compliant now. And so this can all happen automatically. Okay, so that was it for the automatic remediation. Let's now take a step back and look again at the full picture and discuss some next steps.
We've seen how to create assessments and automate evidence collection with Audit Manager. Again, this service will generate reports for auditing.
We've then seen how we can create these security and compliance checks with AWS Security Hub and AWS Config.
We've seen as well how to remediate, how to take action on risks with Systems Manager and how the service interacts with Security Hub and Config for that purpose.
And finally, I would like to stress that all of these services that we discussed work and are actually recommended in a multi-account setup.
Now, as a call to action, we want to invite you to check different compliance resources available. The first QR code is a workshop called Practical Data Protection and Risk Assessment for Sensitive Workloads, so you can go hands-on and test. The second link is the official AWS documentation on compliance, and then the third one is a blog post that actually Laura and I wrote on this subject, so yeah, we really invite you to check that out. And as we always say, of course, you're very welcome to reach out to your account manager or solutions architect because we are here to help you automate compliance at scale. And if you have any questions, you're free to go to the security activation space at the expo. So there are going to be experts there, so you can ask all your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for attending this session. Please have a look at the session survey, and we will be here for any questions that you have. So thank you.
Thank you.